Couple of verses that need to be dealt with, handled separately. They're part of the long litany that Paul has, that we've been reading about, that Paul where he's talking about the household code, the building up of the household of God. So these form part of Paul's instructions for the household of faith, what the household of faith ought to look like if they're going to be healthy. But these are worthy of separate consideration simply because of their topic. So here are these Paul's words in 1 Timothy. To Timothy, he writes this: "All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better, because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves." May God bless to our hearts understanding here of His Word today. We're listening in on this letter from one pastor to another, and we also pulled into the conversation another very personal letter, one of Paul's most personal letters, that letter to Philemon. A letter that is written to Philemon, who is most likely a wealthy man in Colossae, whose slave Onesimus ran away and somehow came in contact with Paul, became a Christian, and became a friend and companion, served Paul in his needs, possibly while Paul is imprisoned in Ephesus. And so we use these two very personal letters to kind of eavesdrop on this most important topic, as we think about what Paul means when he advises Philemon of the possibility that this one who had once been his servant is now his brother, that he's moved from bondservant to brother. We have to get this passage right for this reason. Slavery is not a thing of the past. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation for the second time. He did it in September before victory was assured. He signed it a second time, and it became active January 1st, 1863. And we're tempted, I think we're tempted as Americans to think Civil War won by the North, Emancipation Proclamation issued, slavery's done with. And that simply isn't the case. This didn't put an end to slavery. And this is why it's important for us to get these words right in Paul's first letter to Timothy. Indeed, the effects of slavery still haunt us today. The middle passage is that part of the journey that slave traders would take from the west coast of Africa to places either in South America, the Caribbean, or North America. And that passage saw some 12.5 million Africans over a couple of centuries transported for in the slave trade. Of those 12.5 million, almost 2 million lost their life in that passage. 2 million people, many of them children, lost their lives, thrown overboard in times of disease, in the harsh conditions of that middle passage. It's a past that still haunts. In 1860, 3.9 million slaves in the United States, 60% of the entire slave population of the hemisphere in which we find ourselves. 3.9 million slaves. Slavery is not a thing of the past, and it's why we have to get this passage right. It's estimated that there are over 40 million people today who suffer under some form of modern-day slavery. Some of that is slave labor. Some of that is slavery to the sex trade, sex trafficking trade. Some of it is simply women who are forced into marriages. A large number of those, 1 in 4 of 40 million are children. That's 10 million. So slavery is not a thing of the past. It's why we have to get this passage right as we're thinking about Paul's words, where on first reading it might sound like he is condoning slavery. He is suggesting that slavery is part of the reality of life, and slaves ought to just toe the line. We have to get this passage right. If you want to find out more, this is a little sidebar, if you want to find out more about modern-day slavery, I highly encourage you to go to the website for the International Justice Mission, IJM.org. The International Justice Mission is probably about 12 years old now. It was formed by an American lawyer who made it his purpose to establish an organization that would work with other countries to address the problem of modern-day slavery. You'll find detailed information both with the nature of modern-day slavery, that is a reality, and the things that Christians are doing to counteract it, to combat it. It's a modern-day problem that we've got to address. And so as we think about Paul's words here in 1 Timothy, as we think about his words here, 1 Timothy chapter 6, his advice to the people who he's left behind with Timothy in Ephesus, what does he mean? What is involved with what he's saying about slaves and their attitude toward their masters? Is Paul advocating a wholesale support of slavery? What's going on here? The first thing that we have to remember, we've said this before, is that the gospel is always proclaimed in the context of a culture. The gospel never goes into a situation completely free of a variety of cultural conditions that it is going to be challenged by. And this is what we ought to consider the blessing of the Christian gospel. The blessing of the Christian gospel is that it's a gospel that has the capacity to go into different cultures and take root without suggesting that hearers have to start dressing like a Jew. So the earliest evangelists are Jewish Christians who are proclaiming that their Jewish Messiah is the world's Messiah, and they are going into non-Jewish cultural settings proclaiming that good news. And they don't say you have to become a Jew for you to believe this good news. all of the arguments found in the beginning to the middle of the book of Acts are arguments about that very thing. And the beauty of the gospel is that it enters into different cultural contexts, and it speaks to those contexts, inviting the transformation of those cultures to become and reflect more of what God intended for humankind. The gospel is always enculturated. It's always found in a context. And that's the truth. That's the case for the gospel going into the Roman Empire. And in the Roman Empire, the cultural context is that slavery is a given. Slavery is a given, and the avenues for rejecting slavery or for doing away with slavery are few, if any. So the first concern that we might have with Paul's words here, well, why, Paul, aren't you advocating for the abolition of slavery? Paul, as a Jewish evangelist, doesn't have the kind of access to authority, the kind of access to changes of that sort. You know, as the gospel goes off into these cultures, the need is for, the challenge becomes, how do we, as new converts and as a community of new converts, how do we slowly make the changes that bring our lives in line with the gospel? We've been talking about this, that Paul's words here in chapter 5, chapter 6 are about the household of God. Well, the household of God, as the gospel goes into these new cultural settings, is very messy. Because you have women who are lifted up as being co-equal now in covenant community, who at one point, and culturally speaking, were not. You have slave and free now coming under the same blessing of grace on their own right and worshiping together, when in the cultural setting that never would be the case. You would not have slaves worshiping with their masters on equal footing. Yet that's what's happening in the household of God, and it becomes messy. There's a lot to sort out. There's a lot to sort out. And because of that, because of the sorting out, Paul says this. He says, and this is what Paul is concerned about. Paul is concerned about the truthfulness of the gospel. He's worried about, first and foremost, the witness of the gospel, that people might be persuaded by its truth. And so Paul is saying that sometimes my personal rights need to take a back seat to the cause of the gospel. And that's a hard thing for us to hear sometimes. Just as it was probably a hard thing for some slaves in the city of Ephesus at the time of Paul's writing his letter to Timothy. That there would have been some there who wanted to press their rights. Well, I'm no longer your slave. I am your brother. I'm an equal. We worship together. And it shows up in disrespect. It shows up in creating tension and difficulty. Maybe masters are a little slow to recognize that the challenge of the gospel is precisely that, to set their slaves free and to genuinely treat them as a brother. And so Paul says, in effect, as the household is wrestling with these very challenging situations, make sure you're clear on this, that your rights never supersede the cause of the gospel, the need for the gospel to be heard and for your life to bear witness to its effect. And Paul didn't write it here in 1 Timothy, but he could have. He could have said, do we want to make mockery of Jesus' own example? Who being born in who being the the very likeness of God, who, being endowed with all power and authority, subjects himself to the likes of Pilate and the priests, and allows himself to be killed sacrificially. That Jesus' own model of allowing, as Paul writes in Philippians, his divinity, his oneness with the Father, he doesn't consider something to be held on to, and he gives it up, taking on the form of a servant, the same word, interestingly enough. Taking on the form of a servant for the sake of the gospel. And Paul is simply suggesting, look, slavery may not be God's intention for human relations and economics, and the running of individual households. But as a Christian, if your pressing your rights creates difficulty, and people start to say, well, look what that Christianity, look what that gospel is doing. It's causing all of these slaves to be disrespectful, to bring dishonor on the gospel, is Paul's concern. What he is saying is that our individual, my personal rights don't take precedence over the truth of the gospel. We keep these words in background as we wrestle with Paul's words in Timothy. These words from the letter to the Galatians, one of Paul's first letters, are a summary of the gospel, the effect of the gospel. And there is neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free. There is no more male and female. And again, those are the three primary ways that the covenant people excluded others. That if you are not a freeborn Jewish man, you are not a full participant in the gospel. You could not be a full participant, in the covenant. You could not be a full participant in the covenant as a Gentile. You could not be a full participant in the covenant community as a slave, only as you were attached to somebody. You were not a full participant as a female. Remember what we said last week about the status of women needing to be connected to a man in order to be a covenant participant. Paul says that's no longer the case. And this basic gospel message is what challenges, throws the challenge for slaves, for servants, for women, to want to press their rights. And he says, don't let your rights get in the way of people believing the truth of the gospel. What is Paul not saying? Paul is not saying that slavery is okay. That it ought to be embraced out of principle. He doesn't say that it is in any way connected with the will of God, God's purposes for humankind. Note this, that in these household codes, as he talks about husbands and wives, and he talks about children, he will often go back to the creation account as a way of grounding the nature of the relationships within the household. He doesn't do that with slavery. Why? Because slavery cannot be grounded in creation. It wasn't part of God's good intention. And Paul is not saying that it is, that it ought to be something that should be propped up, that should be kept in place. Paul recognizes as a disciple of Jesus that slavery in and of itself is an abomination to the Lord. Paul is not saying that it is to be kept at all costs. And so we have this beautiful story of Philemon and Onesimus. Onesimus, a runaway slave. It becomes for us a nice little snapshot, so that as we try and understand 1 Timothy chapter 6, here is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, where it actually gets fleshed out. And again, what's interesting is that Colossae and Ephesus are relatively close, and so Paul's letter to Timothy may in part be spurred on by the ongoing conflicts or problems that are being experienced in both of those communities with regard to the attitude of slave holders, of those who have slaves, own slaves, and those who are slaves. And Paul makes this appeal. Note this, that Paul appeals to Philemon's conscience. You know, he says, look, I could order you by my apostolic authority to receive Onesimus back as a full brother. Not a slave, but a full brother. I could, by my apostolic authority, order you to do that. But I don't want it to be something that is forced upon you. I'm appealing to your conscience as a fellow follower of Christ, and as one who yourself, you owe me your very life. So probably the indicator there is Philemon is one of Paul's converts on Paul's missionary journeys to to Colossae. And Philemon has become a Christian because Paul has gone to proclaim the gospel there. Paul says, look, I want you to do this because you recognize deep in your heart that it's right, that it's true. That if anything, for me to embrace Onesimus is to bear testimony to the depth of gospel grace. Onesimus has obviously wronged his master, Philemon, in some way, whether he's stolen money or he has stolen reputation. It's not quite clear. It seems like maybe he's run off with some funds as an attempt to escape slavery. He's run into Paul and he's become a Christian. And Paul says, receive him back. Receive him back as I have received him, as I have become a father to him. This ought to be good news for those who suffer modern-day slavery, because we as the people of God ought to be first in line advocating for the elimination of slavery wherever it's found, in whatever form it's found. The people of God, Christians all around this globe, ought to be advocating and putting resources into the cause of ending the kind of slavery that 40 million people suffer around the world. And some of it, the most horrific slavery, subjection of young children and young girls to sex trafficking in the sex industry. We ought to be at the forefront. We ought to hear Paul's words when he says, I appeal to your conscience. I appeal to your conscience to do this, to recognize that these, the least of those in our midst, are children of mine, are children of God. Many of these who suffer in slavery are fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Do we hear Paul's words of appeal to Philemon, and do we hear them hearkening to us, challenging us here today in the 21st century to take seriously this cause, this need? And to do so in ways that are winsome, are respectful of others, are that acknowledge the fact that the gospel is on display and needs to be borne witness to in the ways that we go about our lives and our pursuit of justice. You know, the good news is embodied in this short letter to Philemon. This good news of a runaway slave who is caught up into the gospel, the story of Jesus, and his life is transformed. And his life is transformed, and the lives of those of people around him are transformed by the power of grace, that grace takes that which is broken and ugly, and it makes it beautiful and whole again. And that's what Paul wants. He longs for it for Philemon, Don't you realize, Philemon, that your life will be all the fuller as you receive Onesimus back to yourself, not as a bondservant anymore, but as a brother, as one who is caught up in the grace of God in Jesus Christ, the same as you. Grace, this great equalizer. It's an equalizer that says it doesn't matter about intellect. Really smart people and really dumb people share that grace alike. Really culturally sophisticated people and people who are a little less culturally sophisticated share that grace in the same level. It doesn't matter economic class. It doesn't matter language. It doesn't matter the kind of dress that we wear. That grace is shared in equal quantity. We are equally children of God before the Holy Father, Son, and Spirit. You know, Paul's letter to Timothy in that chapter 6 might be a challenge to us. It might be a challenge to us. Maybe you work for an employer who you have a really hard time respecting. And you'd like to be able to press your rights a little bit. And you know that to do so would somehow compromise your witness as a Christian. There may be other contexts, in other words, where we have to live out that same calling to allow what might be legitimate rights of ours to be take a back seat, to be put on hold in the interest of the gospel. What might that look for each of us? I'm not sure. It requires kind of a day-to-day, week-to-week reflection on what is my relationship like with those with whom I work, with those with whom I play, those among my neighbors, as citizens of this country. What does it look like as do we make ourselves servant of all for the sake of the gospel? That's what Paul would like for us to ask here today. Are we willing to make ourselves servant of all for the sake of the gospel? Not just the people who like us, but the servant of all for the sake of the gospel. The promise is this, that when we do, when we embrace the fullness of the gospel in that way, that we, like Philemon, stand to have our lives blessed beyond measure. May our servant of all carry over to figuring out how we can be advocates for those who suffer slavery yet today. Let's pray together.